Instead of focusing on winning arguments, we're teaching the basic fundamentals of sales and marketing and how we can use them to win in the world of politics, teaching you how to meet people where they're at on the issues they care about. Welcome to The Brian Nichols Show. Well, hey there, folks. Brian Nichols here on The Brian Nichols Show, and thank you for joining us on, I don't know if I can call it a fun-filled episode today, because we're talking about some not fun-filled things, but yes, I am still your humble host, Brian Nichols, and thank you for joining us on today's episode. Today, I am joined by the one, the only, Reed Cooley. Thank you for joining us on the program, my friend. How are you?
I'm great, Brian. How are you?
I can't complain, man. I mean, all that's going on in the world, I honestly, I cannot complain. I am happy. I'm in the great state of Indiana, along with all the Hoosier hospitality, getting settled in. And yes, I look around the world and all the chaos that's unfolding right now over in the Eastern Europe. And gotta say, count my blessings every single day, my friend. And thank you for joining us on the program. Let's introduce you to the audience, Reed. It's the first time we've had you in the program. So who are you and what got you into this greater liberty world?
Well, so my life was turned upside down by a guy named Ron Paul several years ago. I want to say it was 2013, 2014 was whenever I got involved in the Liberty movement. I was an undergraduate student at Baylor University, which is actually where Rand Paul studied for about 3 years of his undergraduate career. A lot of people don't know that. Got involved with the Young Americans for Liberty chapter there, just as an activist on campus, doing Young Americans for Liberty things. Went on to a career in archaeology, double majored in anthropology and history, did several archaeological projects, and then decided that I wanted to do something a little bit more important to the present day world than digging up old people and their garbage. So I got in touch with Young Americans for Liberty again, decided that I wanted to fight for what I really cared about most at the end of the day. Worked on several campaigns, did some work for YAL for several years, and now I'm doing a podcast, doing writing, doing a lot of things, trying to carry the fight for liberty everywhere I can, like on this great show. So that's me in a nutshell.
Well, we appreciate you joining the show, especially with what you're bringing to the table, and that is a fresh perspective. And we need that today, especially as we're approaching a very topic, and that is war over in the eastern bloc of Europe. We have Russia and Ukraine. Russia officially invading Ukraine. I think the last report I saw that Russia had just taken over Chernobyl and the nuclear power plant wastes and destruction site that took place there back in the 90s, 80s, somewhere in there ballpark. Am I right in there? Yeah, somewhere in there. Anyways, so we're seeing right now the absolute just crumbling of what had been some sense of peace, or maybe at the very least stability over the past few years. But this is not new. And I think this is one thing that's important for the audience to take away today, especially people who are on, as Michael Scott would say, threat level midnight, is that this is not something that is new happening over in Eastern Europe, but rather this just seems to be another chapter in quite a long set of sagas and chapters that have taken place here over decades on end, especially since 1945. So, Reed, let's start off. How did we get here in this situation where we have Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation now currently invading Ukraine? If you could give us the Sparknotes version, if you would.
Okay, Sparknotes. I don't want to get too historical with your audience, but I think it's a bit of an understatement to say that this is an issue that goes back decades with respect to Ukraine and the rest of Eastern Europe. When we look at the rest of Eastern Europe, what is today Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, the Baltic states, or Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, we're talking about a part of the world that has been just repeatedly divided, conquered, subdued, terrorized by larger surrounding powers. And, the borders of what we now call Ukraine, they've not been there for a very long time. They've not really been around for anything over a century. So when you talk about, really the Eastern Bloc, you're talking about a part of the world that has been partitioned in all sorts of different ways for 700, 800 years, right? So what we're seeing happen today is a trend that goes all the way back to, you could say, the High Middle Ages, right? I mean, I don't want to get too historical with your audience and bog them down with different details about, how Ukraine was divided in the 13th century or a few centuries later by the Mongol invasion, or about, the partition of Poland in the late 17th century, for example. But that's really what's going on here. We're just seeing echoes of history, echoes of a very long-standing trend. And something that we have to understand is that Vladimir Putin has made this abundantly clear many times. He doesn't even really consider, Ukraine, what we call Ukraine, to be a country, at least not in the same way in which we in the West consider countries to be countries, right? Whenever you go around the world, you encounter that there are many different definitions of what constitutes a country, right? Putin has made this clear many times. He doesn't consider Ukraine to be a country in the same way as, let's say, the United States or France or whatever else, right? So this is something that is really centuries in the making, but we can reflect on recent decades, right? It's important to understand that the borders that constitute the country of Ukraine today, it's not a monolithic country in the least bit. When you talk about the southern and the eastern region of Ukraine, right? Crimea, Donbass, everything east of the Dnieper River, you're talking about part of the country that is ethnically Russian, that is linguistically Russian, at least in much larger degrees than other parts of the country, such as in the northeast, where Kiev, the capital, is located. But it's worth acknowledging that just because people speak Russian and are ethnically Russian, that doesn't mean that they want to be invaded or conquered by another country, right? And it's also worth noting that Putin, in invading the Donbass region, as in what we've seen over the last 2 days, and attempting to incorporate it into greater Russia, he's actually tipping the balance of power in the Ukrainian government towards his enemies. Like, that's something that has to be taken into account here, right? So obviously, we're not going to excuse in the least bit what Vladimir Putin is doing or what the Russian government is doing. But we have to understand this is something that is centuries in the making. It's absolutely intensified in decades and in recent years, going all the way back to the infamous coup in 2014, right? There was the ironically named Revolution of Dignity, as it was called, where they overthrew Viktor Yanukovych for the unforgivable crime of deciding that maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to be a part of a greater geopolitical alliance forged in 1949, whenever Harry Truman was still president. He didn't necessarily think that it was to his own country's advantage to be a part of a greater geopolitical alliance, being NATO, that was forged in the geopolitical landscape of post-World War II. So when it comes to a lot of what we're seeing today, and we can say that it really intensified in 2014. Obviously, I don't think that that's a very revolutionary argument. No pun intended there. I think that it's very fair to make that sort of observation, because what we want to do here is really try, and what I try to do with my commentary on the subject is keep it limited to only what can be verified, which is so awfully difficult in this world of mass propaganda at every single corner, this sort of age of misinformation that we live in, right? You keep it limited to only what I can verify through credible sources, and really just talk about the entire situation as dispassionately as possible. That is to say, without making value judgments necessarily about who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, anything like that, right? Or at least not operating from any such premise. So, but we can look at what happened in 2014. The United States backed coup against Viktor Yanukovych, for the unforgivable act of standing up for what he thought his own country's interest should be, because Providence forbid that heads of state stand up for their own country's interests over the interest of some greater geopolitical alliance that they should, for whatever reason, feel subjected to. So the United States obviously has a lot of blame in what's going on here, right? But it's also worth noting that, with respect to just trying to understand where the balance of power lies, Russia really seems to have all the leverage right now. Like, set morals aside, the morals of what's going on here, the leverage really seems to be set, on Russia's side here. So their desire for their preferred outcome in this situation is much, much stronger, meaning that they see this conflict as something much more worth fighting for than NATO and the US do. Like, Russia, they obviously don't want NATO expanding eastward because they don't want missiles within 10 minutes or less of their capital, right? I think that's a pretty understandable concern from any perspective. So their desire for their preferred outcome is much more intense than NATO and the United States, and they have geographic proximity, right? I mean, this is a pretty much unavoidable axiom of all things war, that geography matters a tremendous amount, right? So by geographic proximity, I mean that Ukraine, or at least the targeted parts of Ukraine, are much closer to Russia and much more subject to their missile attacks, as we've seen over the last few days.
Wow. So that was a lot. And I wanted to just have that right there, because that's a great starting off point to now bridge the conversation even more. And one of the parts that you started to bring up, and I think we want to focus a little bit on this, is not just the how we got here, but also the implications of what could happen as a result of this. So I've heard some people who they compared this to Iraq war. And I just don't think this is a fair comparison, because now we're watching a situation where if the push is to have America get involved, or to have the NATO countries get involved, we are now starting to play this really weird and dangerous game with nuclear weapons at the disposal of Russia. And I think it was in 2019 or 2018 or 2019 that the Russian Federation just went and revamped their entire nuclear arsenal. So, or maybe it was a little earlier than that, I forget the specific date. But the fact that just happened, and the fact that now we are watching what's happening unfold over in the Eastern Bloc, and now we're seeing a growing push for war. The drumbeats of war have been beating here, especially on the I'd say corporate press. I almost said mainstream press, but Michael Mass would get mad at me. But no, the corporate press, they've really been beating these drumbeats of war. And let me ask you, Reed, I mean, do you see a situation where America gets involved in a conflict here, and especially considering the fact that we do have nuclear implications?
I want to plead Socratic ignorance here, a little bit of just humility, and say that I honestly don't know. That's just being fair, and it's trying to be intellectually honest. But there are observations and correlations that are absolutely worth pointing out. I hope that we don't go in that sort of direction, but as you're describing right now, Brian, the drums of war are echoing through history again. And it really seems like the war propagandists of today are reaching into the past and drawing from it all of the weapons they need to mobilize people towards war again today, right? So if you read the Washington Post, The Atlantic, Foreign Policy Magazine, maybe NPR, CNN, Insider Magazine, you name it, any one of the sort of state media complex outlets, you'll find so many of the same old familiar, just worn out tropes.
Yep.
that we should know better than to listen to at this point. It's a narrative of some hyper aggressive expansionist autocrat suddenly waking up, and for no apparent reason at all, just deciding to attack some innocent group of people somewhere, whether they're in his own country or not, right? We saw the media spinning this narrative with Saddam Hussein. We saw it again with Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and now they're spoon-feeding it to us again with Vladimir Putin, right? It's the same exact kind of story that they're telling us. But it's also worth pointing out that it was just 3 months ago. Putin wrote a letter to Washington communicating that they did not want NATO to expand into Ukraine because they didn't want missiles to be in such close proximity to Moscow, right? I mean, with missiles in Ukraine, you're talking about the possibility that they could strike the capital of Russia in 4, maybe 5 minutes. This is a perfectly legitimate concern from any point of view. I mean, if Russia wanted to put missiles in, let's say, Mexico or Canada, I think that the American people would have a lot of anxiety about that, and rightfully so. But it just so happens that we do have an historic example that we can point to, that being the obvious one, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which Jack Kennedy actually had to recruit his brother to secretly defuse because he didn't want the stupidity and the politics of the State Department at large to be responsible for trying to negotiate such a tense situation. As far as the outcome of how this goes, Brian, I want to say that I don't foresee something as horrendous as nuclear war. My instincts tell me that sounds a bit hyperbolic, and I absolutely hope that I'm right. what I also hope happens from this is that, people will finally see the futility of NATO. People will see that this is an obsolete institution founded in 1949, and that it's high time to replace it with an America First foreign policy built on non-interventionism. I know that whenever people hear America First, they obviously think of our most recent president in this country, but I personally don't shy away from the term because just from a strategic and messaging point of view, I see it as a way of connecting with an audience outside the liberty sphere that we need to connect with and that we need to win support over with. So I think that it's time to replace it with a pro-America foreign policy built on non-interventionism, and I hope that that this can be a silver lining in a very dark situation in which people are dying. That we can see the futility of these entangling alliances, as George Washington called them, over 2 centuries ago.
Yeah. Well, Reed,
we'll start away from this expectation that the United States and the people and the countries like Ukraine just start to move away from this.
Yeah. As I say, Reed, and one of the things I think, as we're moving forward now, people, they want to better understand not just how we got here, but how we can avoid this happening in the future. Now, I know it sounds a little weird to talk about, well, how can we avoid this from happening again in the future? But we need to start planning ahead, because right now, if we're just constantly reacting and trying to put out fire after fire, we're going to be having this conversation again 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years. It will cycle constantly on end, and it will not stop until we officially break that cycle. So let's start here, Reed. What are some actionable steps that we can recommend? And obviously, this is a little difficult, right? Because we cannot, as individuals, go out and just make these changes overnight, but we can at least start to pressure our politicians in certain directions and certain elected officials in certain directions to help them do the right thing. So what's the best way to start doing that to, again, avoid this from ever happening again? Or is that possible? I don't even know.
Well, it's important to keep in mind that war is the health of the state. As long as you have states, you will have rampant and unjustified levels of war, no matter what, right? So we have to understand that what we're seeing right now, this is just one of many symptoms of the greater fight against the state. This is what happens whenever you live on a globe that's dominated, not by an appreciation for liberty, but by a collection of super states, all vying for resources and interest and money with each other and willing to kill whoever they have to in order to get it. But in fighting the state, we have to understand its many tricks, right? And I think that we can extrapolate some of them from everything that's happened lately, right? To word it the way that Murray Rothbard might have, what we're seeing now is one of the state's many tricks. Actually, there's an example that just popped into my head, a very concrete one I think that I can laser focus on right now. I'll never forget 2 days ago, it was, and Joe Biden, he gave this press conference in which he told the American people that there are going to be prices here at home that the American people are going to have to pay for Putin's actions, right? I think he said, defending freedom will have costs for us here at home. I think that was an exact quote, right? It's just that, that stood out to me because that sounds so much like the rhetoric that they spoon-fed us as they were preparing to pass, for example, the Patriot Act, right? They take something really stupid, really offensive, perhaps even something really deadly that the state wants to do, that the government wants to do, and they describe it as though it's some form of noble sacrifice that the people should feel honored to make for patriotic reasons or for nationalistic reasons or whatever else, right? In other words, they're ascribing some sort of virtue in ceding over more liberty and ceding over more power to the state. And this same form of propaganda is going to be used against the anti-war crowd here in the United States. You don't care about freedom because you don't care about defending freedom in Ukraine. They will tie the prices that Americans have to pay, whether it's at the gas pump or it's literally in terms of their liberties, to being a good American. If you're not willing to pay the price, for freedom, if you're not willing to defend freedom by potentially going to die in a war in a different part of the world that really has no impact on you at all, then you're not a good American. But as I'm describing that, it's also worth noting that this is not always the strategy that the state uses in order to get the people support for something like war. In many cases, the state and the state media complex, they try to persuade us that there is no cost to war, or perhaps that that we'll even make money by going to war somewhere. It's describing that, the example of Syria comes back to mind years ago. I remember hearing, the mainstream media telling us back then that if we go to Syria, we'll actually make money because we'll go there and we'll actually take the oil, right? We'll get rich. So it's worth noting, to bring it back to your question, Brian, that this is symptomatic of the fight against the state. War is the health of the state, and the state has a wide variety of tricks and narratives that they will employ in order to gain the people's consent for whatever atrocious thing they want to do.
Well, I think right now your average person is waking up to realizing that things aren't as squishy and awesome and rainbows and butterflies as always they thought they were. And maybe that's a good thing, because we sometimes get too comfortable in the appreciation of certain liberties and certain rights without understanding how quickly they can be taken away. So hopefully this is going to wake some people up that, it is important to start focusing on things more specifically here at home. And with that, folks, if you're interested in learning more about how Reed has been talking about things, well, obviously he has got a great podcast. And Reed, we want people to be able to continue that conversation with you. So both areas, podcast, social media, contact, all that fun stuff. Where can they go ahead and continue the conversation?
Now, the best place to find me is on Twitter. You can find me at @JReedCooley. That is letter J, ReedCooley.
Awesome. Alrighty. And with that, folks, if you enjoyed today's episode, please do me a favor. Go ahead and give it a share. And when you do, make sure you go ahead and give Reed a tag, as well as yours truly at B Nichols Liberty. And folks, I'll make it easy for you, by the way. Go to the podcast catcher that you use of choice. Click the artwork. It'll bring you right to briannicholsshow.com, where you can find Reed's episode, which just happens to be episode 450. 50 to go. We're at 500, Reed. We're almost there. And also, I know, I don't know where that time went either. But also, folks, if you could be so kind when you're there, please go ahead and give us a 5-star rating and review. Every little bit helps. But with that being said, it is Brian Nichols signing off here on The Brian Nichols Show for Reed Cooley. We'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening to The Brian Nichols Show. Find more episodes at briannicholsshow.com.